What do you want? What do you desire? And more interestingly, why do you desire what you desire? The readings today has pushed me to re-engage the scholarship of Rene Girard. And Rene Girard is, he died a few years ago, ended his career at Stanford. He's a Frenchman, started his career as a scholar of literature. And his endeavors moved him into history and sociology and anthropology and even theology. But he started as a literary critic. And he read the ancient classic texts, he read myths, and one of the things he set out to do was to figure out what the commonalities were, rather than a lot of the literature scholarship at the time was looking at what was unique and different. He was looking for common themes, and he uncovered something, he discovered something about human desire. And one of the things he uncovered, what he uncovered was that in contrast to the sort of romantic notion of desire, which is something in my heart is drawn toward a particular thing, like the object of my desire, what Girard noticed again and again and again was that desire really didn't spring from the person, but desire was something that was copied from another. It was, in his words, mimetic, like in miming. It was imitative. And that how desire functions more often than not is we see someone with something. Or we see someone desiring something or getting something or having something, and that desire gets evoked in our own hearts. We see this in kindergarten when there's a basket of toys, and they're all of sort of objectively equal value, and one child picks up the train, and then another child invariably wants the train because that's the one thing that someone else has. I notice it in myself when I'm shopping, and there's this 50% off table, and they're just select items, and someone picks something up, and the minute they do, I think, oh, I think I want that thing. It's also obvious when we look at advertising and the way advertisements are created. An advertisement about a basketball shoe doesn't talk about the merits of that particular shoe. How much cushioning it has or whatever. It's held by Michael Jordan, and therefore I want that shoe because Michael Jordan has that shoe. Rene Girard noticed that how our desires, what we want, what we crave, really comes from just by our social interactions with other people. And he took that further, but I want to pause right there. And also, that idea, that notion is reinforced by the 10th commandment, where God says, don't covet, stop covet. It's what we do. Now, Rene Girard, when he was creating this theory, was not a Christian, was not looking at it through a spiritual lens. He was just looking at it through the lens of his scholarship. But from a Christian perspective, taking this notion of desire being driven by what other people are desiring, and knowing, we know that only leads to frustration. It's an invitation for us, if we're going to copy our desires off of someone else, why not choose Jesus? Why not look at Jesus as who we want to model our desires on? And it's sort of what gets at saying, Jesus is my Lord and Savior. It's that Jesus is my model of how I want to be human. And I want to sort of shape my desires on what Jesus is desiring, which is a relationship with God and holy communion with one another, grounded in love. It's having love as a priority and compassion as a priority and communion as a priority, all of that stuff that ties into what St. Augustine says. You know, my soul is restless until it rests in thee. So rather than investing our souls in what everyone else is desiring, invest our souls in what Jesus is desiring. So that's helpful. That's helpful, and it's interesting, and it's a helpful diagnostic when we're sort of spiritually dissatisfied. We can sort of look inward and think, well, what's happening here, and you know, where are my desires being driven from, and that kind of thing. So that's very helpful. But that's not where I want to focus, because Rene Girard took his thinking in a much deeper direction. Because the next thing, so he writes a book on this desire. The next thing he does is he asks the question, if our desires are mimetic, if what I desire is based on what you desire, then that is going to inherently lead to rivalry. Right? Because I'm not desiring this because it's just good in my, but I'm desiring what you desire, which means we're desiring the same thing. And someone else is desiring it, and someone else is desiring it, so it creates what he called mimetic rivalry. There is this rivalry that is just inherent in the way that desire works. And the question he asks is, why are we alive? How have we survived as humans if sort of in our psychological makeup is this rivalry? How did societies happen? What was the coherent force that made a society rather than just this cacophonous slaughter of people, you know, killing each other over this rivalry? And so he turned that lens back to his study of mythology and literature and history. And what he realized that in all of these societies that were formed over time and over geography, the common sort of thing that created social cohesion was a common enemy. So there would be this mimetic rivalry, and tensions would begin to increase, and then something would happen before this gaggle got to the breaking point. Something would happen, and they would identify a problem. They would identify an enemy. And they would have this shared enemy, and they would realize, you know, things are getting really heated and tense around here. And the reason they're heated and tense is because of Fred, or Tom, or Jane. And everyone would go, yeah, you know, you're right. It's all that person's problem. And then, like, tensions would rise, and they would take, like, this identified enemy, and they would kill the identified enemy. And then this mystical thing happened. They were filled with peace and happiness. And they kind of liked each other. And that peace, that catharsis of like nuking the enemy, which is the catharsis I get at the end of every action-adventure movie. You know, when the bad person is killed, I'm like, ah. So as a society, there was this sort of, we got rid of the problem. And it was so, like, surprising that they thought, clearly God must be in this. Right? Clearly that person must have been really bad, and us killing the really bad must have really pleased God, because there's this peace that we did not expect in our community. So then they would sacralize the violence and write the myth that God really wanted this violence to happen. And then, when the thing would wear off, you know, the cozy feeling would wear off, then they would start recreating this. And that was the genesis of human sacrifice that then shifted to animal sacrifice, was they created a ritual around this thing that worked so well. And they all invested that this is going to work so well. So killing the next person still worked, and still worked, and still worked, until it didn't. And then they would have to come up with a new scapegoat. Anyway, he sees this pattern again and again and again. And he realizes that the thing that creates social cohesion, that brings people together in community, is a scapegoat. And that scapegoating would lead to violence. And often that violence was sacralized. Like it's God wanting us to do this violence because clearly that person is evil. And then once he had those lenses, like once he thought, wow, I'm seeing this again and again and again, he saw it all over the place. And you can like see that if you start thinking about how social cohesion is created by creating a common enemy. Now we've evolved beyond human sacrifice, and we've evolved beyond animal sacrifice, but we haven't evolved beyond creating an enemy group that we then ostracize, that we have some level of violence toward, and that level of violence could be ghettoizing, it could be ostracizing, or it could be just hating on. And there's a way in which the hating on creates community, and it makes us feel good. That was the next huge insight that Rene Girard came up with, was this sort of universal scapegoating mechanism that every community had as a component of as their in their being, as their genesis. And this thing gets repeated again and again and again. And now, because of this language has been around for a while, it's not shocking. Like what I'm saying to you, you can go, yes, we see that. We see that right now. We see that in conversations that are happening right now. But it didn't used to be so obvious. And Rene Girard was like shining a light on how this thing functions. So his second book that he wrote was on the scapegoating mechanism and how all of this functions. Then he read the Bible. Now, Rene Girard was raised in France as a Roman Catholic, but he was culturally a Roman Catholic. He wasn't a practicing Roman Catholic. He hadn't studied the Bible or even read the Bible as an adult. But as this scholar and literary critic, and who's reading all of the classic myths, decides to read the Bible. And as he's reading the Bible, he is blown away. Because the Bible is different than the other stories, the other myths, the other literature that he was reading. And what he saw in the Bible was that this whole scapegoating mechanism is completely undermined in the Bible. It was as if, in his mind, the Bible was written as an antidote to the scapegoating mechanism. That Jesus came primarily to do away with the scapegoating mechanism. And he noticed some things in the Old Testament. Now, there was plenty of stuff in the Old Testament that reinforced the scapegoating mechanism. You know, the Israelites hate the Philistines, and God helps the Israelites like nuke the Philistines, and all is right with the world. And you know, there's enough of that common way of thinking that's in the Bible. But at the same time, in the Old Testament, there would be like hints that there's cracks in the system. And maybe the Bible is pushing against the scapegoating mechanism. When Cain kills Abel, instead of the story being written that Abel was bad and Cain was good, the soil cries out for Abel's blood. At the end of the Genesis story, or the Noah story, you know, there are ancient flood myths in lots of different cultures. So a common myth is God's pissed off at the people because they're so bad, so a flood comes to wipe them all away for a grand do-over. The one thing that's different in the Old Testament version, in the biblical version, is afterwards God regrets what he did. God laments and says, you know, that was a big mistake. I shouldn't have done it. So you get just the beginnings of questioning this foundation of scapegoating and doing violence against the scapegoat. And then comes Jesus. And Jesus is all about, from Girard's viewpoint, all about challenging the scapegoating that's going on. And part of what was socially cohesive for the Israelites, for the Hebrews in Jewish day, what was socially cohesive was this very strict Torah law and this scapegoating of people who didn't fit into the category of being pure. And it was the prostitutes, and it was the tax collectors, and it was the sinners, which were the people that Jesus went to. And one of the things that is necessary for scapegoating to work is for you to actually believe that the enemy is bad. That they're really bad. They really are bad. They really are a problem. You have to believe that the enemy is bad. That the scapegoat people are bad. And it's better if you can put the stamp of approval of God on that. Right? God says they're bad. What Jesus did was he went to those people, the prostitutes, the sinners, and the tax collectors, and he said, the kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God is right here. So he's pushing back at this scapegoating mechanism. And he has these teachings, like love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. He's trying to tear down this whole scapegoating thing. And then what happens is Jesus becomes the scapegoat. Jesus becomes the identified enemy. Jesus becomes the problem because he's threatening the whole system. And everyone in the story rises up against Jesus. And Jesus is killed. Jesus is found guilty and he's executed, and everyone participates in it, including the disciples. And the odd thing that happens in the story that I never really noticed before was that enemies come together. The Romans and the Jews come together. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, who hate each other, become strange bedfellows in persecuting Jesus. There's even this thing in Luke where Pilate and Herod become friends, and Luke says that they were enemies beforehand, but in this killing of Jesus, they became friends, which is that scapegoating mechanism. And us all hating on the same thing, we become friends. And you see all of that happen in the story of Jesus. What's different in the story of Jesus, Girard says, is that this is like the first time that story is told from the perspective of the scapegoat. And not from the perspective of the people doing the hating. Because usually the story is told by the winners who've done the hating. And they say, you know, we had to kill this person, but this person was horrible. But here's a story that's written from the perspective of the scapegoat. And what are we told again and again and again in the Gospels? What did Jesus do to deserve death? Nothing. Jesus did nothing to deserve death. And in order for scapegoating to work, you have to believe that the person you killed was bad. And Jesus did nothing to deserve death. And we play this out on Good Friday when all of us shout, crucify him, when we know he was innocent. Because it wants to highlight this sense that this was not okay, this was not just. And in Luke's gospel, when Jesus dies on the cross, the next thing that is said is the soldier at the foot of the cross says, surely this man was innocent. We have just killed an innocent person. Now that creates this thing in our brain where we start thinking, you know, Jesus was killed unjustly. He was a scapegoat that was killed unjustly. And that was wrong. And if that was wrong, and Jesus was really innocent, he wasn't as bad as everyone said he was, then maybe other scapegoating is wrong. And we begin to challenge. And then we think back on his teachings about loving your enemy. And it begins to challenge the foundation of scapegoating, which is the foundation that all of our societies are built on. And it becomes like this virus, this computer virus in the system, where we start to question, so that now when we see scapegoating happening, there's a part of us that goes, no, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's right. I don't think they're all bad. And I don't think, and it begins to crack the foundation of this system that our humanity has been built on for millennia. Then there's one other thing. Jesus, in the resurrection, comes back. Now, this is a story that we know. The story that we know is you have a hero. The hero's killed. The hero comes back to life. So maybe he wasn't killed. He was just like 95% killed. So the bad people kill the hero, and he's down. It's like Rocky after being pummeled, and he's down on the mat. The hero comes back up, and what does the hero do? The hero retaliates. Except in this story, we have Jesus come back to life, and he doesn't retaliate. He doesn't participate in that scapegoating violence cycle. He says, forgive and love, and forgive and love, and forgive and love, and the kingdom of heaven is near. Now, what Rene Girard sees happen is that Jesus is trying to eliminate the scapegoating mechanism. Jesus is trying to show us, and it happens partly just by becoming aware of it. Because scapegoating works best when you don't realize it's going on because you think they really are that bad and they deserve your wrath. And we are much better without them. So just by showing us what's happening, and by sort of modeling this forgiveness and teaching this forgiveness, he's trying to undermine the scapegoating mechanism. Now, if we lose the scapegoating mechanism, then all hell breaks loose. Because the scapegoating mechanism is what has been keeping us socially together. Because it's so much easier to be together when we're hating on someone. And if we're not hating on someone, then we actually have to deal with the fact that you bug me. But when we were busy hating on someone, I didn't have to deal with the fact that you bugged me because we had this other thing to work on that made me feel good. But if we lose the scapegoating mechanism, if we say, we're not doing that ever again, then we actually have to be in a relationship with one another. And, which is sort of where Jesus is trying to teach an alternative to scapegoating, and that's the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And that's learning to live in relationship with one another and in love with one another, which means you have to exercise forgiveness and grace and kindness and compassion and all of that. And you have to stop basing your desires on what someone else wants and rather get in touch with the core of your heart. Now, this is way too much Rene Girard for one morning. But I wanted to, the lessons today, St. Paul saying, there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, sort of breaking down the ways that we divide and other and scapegoat. And this gospel story of this person who's been so crazy that he's been sort of shoved out of the town, and all the dysfunction of the town. He can be symptomatic of all the dysfunction of the town, and we can just sort of turn our attention on this person and not really deal with one another. All of those stories led me into this, and rather than just exegeting those stories, I wanted to spend a little bit of time giving you this lens. And like all lenses, this is Rene Girard's theory of explaining everything. And like all theories that explain everything, they're not perfect. But this is like 80% good. And I think using Rene Girard's language and thinking around how our desires are shaped and around how our society functions and the pattern that we're in right now of scapegoating. And then the invitation to not just pay attention to how those horrible people are scapegoating, but how we're scapegoating those horrible people who are scapegoating. To invite us into this, to open our eyes, to see how this is working, and then entering this hard, challenging path of Jesus. Where if we're not going to have scapegoating that binds us together, then we've got to find something